Have you ever felt like you were being watched? Really watched? Not just by people, but by something else? Something unseen, just out of sight? This man took a job watching security cameras at a house far away in the woods. Peace and quiet, they promised. But what he saw on those monitors, what he heard, it still stays with me. If you're brave enough, watch on. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will make you think. Hey everyone, it's been a while since I shared a story. This one's different. It's not something I read online or heard from a friend. This happened to me. And honestly, I still can't shake it. It's like a shadow clinging to the edges of my mind, always there, just out of sight, but you know it's there. See, I needed a job, badly. City life was suffocating me. The constant noise, the relentless crowds, the feeling of being watched even when you were alone in your own apartment. It was like the city itself was breathing down your neck, never letting you truly relax. I needed out. I craved silence, open space, the kind of quiet where you could actually hear yourself think. So when I saw an ad online for a security guard position in a remote rural area, I practically threw myself at it. Peace and quiet, the ad promised in bold letters. Secluded location, competitive pay. It sounded less like a job and more like a sanctuary. Perfect. The job was watching security cameras for they called it an estate. But let's be honest, it was really just an old house, a relic, way out in the woods, miles from the nearest town, maybe even the nearest neighbor. You could drive for what felt like hours on winding, overgrown roads to get there. The kind of place where your cell service died the moment you turned off the main highway. The guy who hired me, Mr. Henderson, was odd, to say the least. He met me in a dimly lit coffee shop on the edge of town. Real pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. Nervous eyes darted around the room, never quite meeting mine directly. He kept fidgeting with his tie, a thin, dark strip against a stark white shirt that seemed too tight around his neck. He didn't say much about the house itself, just that it was private and needed round-the-clock monitoring. His voice was hushed, almost a whisper, like he was afraid of being overheard even in the empty corner of the coffee shop. He drove me out to the property himself in an old, beat-up sedan that smelled faintly of mildew and dust. The house was even more isolated than I'd imagined. Tucked deep within a dense forest, surrounded by towering pines and gnarled oaks that blocked out most of the daylight, even in the middle of the afternoon. It was a large house, imposing, with darkened windows that stared out like empty eyes. The paint was peeling, the wood was weathered, and an air of neglect hung heavy around it. It wasn't just old, it felt tired, worn down by time and something else, something unseen. Henderson showed me the security room. It was in a detached building, a small, cramped space that felt more like a bunker than an office. Monitors lined one wall, glowing with grainy feeds from cameras positioned all over the property. The air in the room was stale and cold, even though it was a warm day outside. The only furniture was a rickety metal desk and a worn-out office chair that creaked loudly when I sat in it. Mostly routine, Henderson mumbled, pointing a trembling finger at the screens. Just keep an eye out for trespassers. He didn't elaborate on what kind of trespassers or why they would be interested in such a remote, seemingly abandoned place, and I didn't ask. I just nodded and tried to look like I understood. I just needed the job and the peace and quiet that came with it. My shift started that night. Perfect, I thought. Quiet, dark, exactly what I wanted. The first few nights were boring, just as Henderson had hinted at. Too boring, almost. Just static on the screens mostly, the wind rustling through the trees. When there was wind, the occasional animal, a deer or raccoon, moving in the dark perimeter of the camera's vision. Peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the silence itself was waiting for something to break it. Then things started to feel off. It was hard to notice at first, small things that you could easily ignore if you weren't watching closely. I was watching the feed from the camera pointed at the front yard. Just trees, grass, the long curving gravel driveway leading up to the house. Empty. Except I could have sworn I saw a shadow move. A flicker at the very edge of the screen near the tree line. Like something tall and thin, impossibly gaunt, just stepped out of sight behind the thick trunks of the pines. It was gone in a blink of the eye. A brief, odd moment in the quiet night. I quickly rewound the tape, my fingers clumsy on the controls. Played it back, frame by frame, my eyes narrowed, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the trees swaying gently in a breeze. I hadn't even noticed. Probably just my eyes playing tricks on me, I reasoned. It was late, the security room was dimly lit. I was probably just tired and seeing things. Yeah, just my imagination running wild in this isolated place. But even as I told myself that, a little seed of doubt had been planted, taking root in the quiet corners of my mind. A tiny tendril of doubt that whispered, what if it wasn't your imagination? The next night, that feeling started again, but it wasn't what I saw. It was what I heard. The security room itself was always silent, except for the low, constant hum of the monitors and the faint whirring of the ventilation system. But on the audio feed from the camera near the back porch, I started hearing things that broke the silence. Faint rustling sounds, like dry leaves crunching underfoot. But there was no wind that night. I checked the weather forecast before my shift. The trees outside, visible on the monitors, were completely still, their branches etched black against the dark night sky. And the rustling, it wasn't just leaves. It sounded heavier, more deliberate, like something large was dragging itself slowly through the dense undergrowth. A heavy, scraping sound that sent shivers down my spine. I reached for the volume knob on the monitor, my hand trembling slightly, and turned it up. The rustling stopped instantly, as if whatever was making the noise had heard me and gone silent. A thick silence that felt like it was waiting for something. Just the static hiss of the audio feed and the low hum of the monitors filling the void. Again, I tried to rationalize it, to force myself to believe it was just animals. Raccoons, deer, maybe even a stray dog or coyote, something like that. Woods are full of noises at night. Especially deep in the woods like this, right? But the silence that followed felt too deliberate, too knowing. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath, listening. But then came the whispers. That's when the dread started to morph into something colder, something sharper. It started on night 5. I was flipping through the camera feeds, a nervous habit I'd developed, constantly checking the perimeter, reassuring myself that everything was normal. Everything looked normal. Empty driveways, still woods, silent house. Until I got back to the camera on the side of the house, the one that faced the deepest part of the woods, the section that seemed to swallow the darkness whole. And I heard it. Faint, breathy whispers, barely audible above the static. Like someone was standing right next to the microphone, their mouth pressed against it, talking too quietly, too urgently to be understood. A hissing murmur that seemed to slither out of the speakers. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My blood ran cold, a wave of fear washing over me. Whispers? In the middle of the woods? Recorded on the security camera feed? It made absolutely no sense. There shouldn't be anyone out there. Henderson had been clear about the isolation, the remoteness. I cranked the volume again, my ears straining, desperate to decipher the sounds. The whispers were still there, persistent just below the cusp of understanding. Mumbled, indistinct, a constant low drone. But definitely voices. Multiple voices maybe, layered over each other, creating a chorus of hushed sounds. I couldn't tell what they were saying, if they were even speaking words at all, or even if they were human voices. It just sounded like whispering, like secrets being shared in the deepest dark, secrets meant for no living ears to hear. Secrets the woods themselves were whispering to the empty house. I frantically checked the other camera feeds, my fingers flying across the monitor controls. Front yard, back porch, driveway, the interior cameras, nothing. Just still and silent, the normal, expected emptiness. The whispers were only on that one camera, the one pointed towards the woods. Just that one camera. I tried my best to think clearly, to find an explanation that was reasonable. It had to be interference. Faulty wiring in that specific camera, picking up some kind of strange radio waves. Something technical, something explainable. That had to be it. Haunted houses, whispers in the woods, that's just stories, campfire tales to scare kids, right? It couldn't be real, could it? But then I started seeing things. It was night 6. I was trying to get my mind off the whispering woods. So I started looking at the cameras inside the house. There were cameras in the main rooms, the living room, the dining room, the long, dark hallways, and even the empty bedrooms upstairs. Henderson said they were mostly just for show, old things from a time when people actually lived there. No one had been inside in years, he said. But I looked at them anyway. I wanted to check everything. I needed something else to think about besides the creepy woods outside. The living room was exactly as you'd expect. Empty, silent, furniture draped in white sheets like ghostly figures, dust motes dancing in the faint infrared light, disturbed only by the swinging camera. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Then I switched to the hallway camera, the one pointed down the long, shadowed corridor on the second floor. And I saw it, a door. At the very end of the hall, barely visible in the dim infrared. Slowly, silently, opening. Creaking open into the darkness. My heart jumped, slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. A cold sweat broke out on my palms. I stared at the monitor, frozen, breath held captive in my lungs. The door continued to open wider, inch by agonizing inch, revealing just darkness. The hallway itself was dimly lit by the infrared glow of the camera, casting long, distorted shadows, but the room behind the opening door was pitch black. An absolute, lightless void. I didn't see anyone, no figure lurking in the shadows. Nothing moved within that impenetrable blackness. The door just opened on its own. I rewound the footage again, my mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Watched the door in reverse, frame by frame. It was definitely, undeniably closed before, firmly shut. Then I switched back to the live feed, my eyes glued to the monitor, watching the hallway door in real time. And there it was. It started to open again, slowly, deliberately, almost thoughtfully, like someone was pushing it open from the other side, from within that pitch black. But there was no one there. No visible force, no hand, no shadow pushing it. I zoomed in on the doorway, pushing the digital zoom to its limit, pixelating the image into a blurry mess, desperately trying to see into the darkness beyond. Trying to see any shape, any form, any indication of what was causing the door to open. Nothing. Just blackness. An empty, all-consuming void. I desperately tried to think of a rational explanation. It was the wind again, I told myself, my voice a shaky whisper in the silent security room. Drafts in the old house, moving through the empty rooms, catching the door just right, causing the door to swing open on its own warped hinges. Maybe a rat pushed up against the door. Anything at all, but not what my gut was screaming at me, what I knew deep down to be true. I should have called Mr. Henderson then. I should have picked up the phone, dialed his number, and stammered out some kind of explanation, some kind of warning. But I didn't. I was too fascinated, in a morbid, terrified way, and maybe deep down a little bit scared to admit that something truly unexplainable, something truly wrong was happening in that house, in those woods. Scared of what Henderson might say, scared of what it might mean for my job, for my sanity. Night 7. The final night. The night everything fell apart. Things escalated, and they escalated fast. It started with the sounds again, as it always seemed to. The whispers were louder now, not just quiet sounds, but loud, urgent, almost yelling. Clearer too, but still you couldn't understand them. And they weren't just whispers anymore. They were chanting. A low, rhythmic, guttural chanting that vibrated through the speakers, through the floor, through my very bones. I still couldn't understand what they were saying, but definitely voices, definitely human, or something disturbingly close to human. A chorus of voices rising and falling in a dark, ancient rhythm. The chanting was coming from the camera in the woods again, that cursed camera that faced the deepest darkness. But this time, as the chanting intensified, it wasn't just audio. There was something visual too, something that made my blood run like ice water. Movement in the trees, no longer subtle flickers of shadow, but blatant, undeniable motion. Shadows shifting and swaying, branches bending and flexing, even though there was still no breath of wind. And then, shapes, dark, indistinct shapes moving between the trees, deeper within the woods but moving closer, always closer. Too tall, impossibly thin, limbs too long, movements too fluid, too quick to be human. They flowed through the trees like smoke, like shadows come to life. My hands were shaking so badly now that I could barely grip my lukewarm coffee cup. The coffee spilled over the side onto the desk, but I didn't even see it. I stared at the monitor, my heart pounding against my ribs, a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated fear. The shapes moved closer to the edge of the woods, drawn by the house, drawn by something. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, more urgent, filling the security room with its dark, rhythmic pulse. And then I saw it. On the camera feed from the back porch, the camera I'd almost forgotten in my terror, something appeared. It was hard to describe, even now, even in the cold light of day, trying to remember everything. Like a shadow ripped from the darkness and given form. Tall, skinny, really long arms and legs, kind of a human-like shape, but really, really wrong. Twisted, distorted, like a grotesque copy of a human figure. It stood on the back porch, perfectly still, impossibly silent, facing the camera lens. Facing me. And in that instant, as my eyes locked to that shadowy form on the screen, I knew, with a cold, paralyzing certainty that went right to my bones, it was looking back. It wasn't just on the camera feed. It was aware of me, on the other side of the lens. It was watching me through the camera. A sudden, sharp static ripped through the chanting, shattering the rhythmic pulse and jolting me in my chair. The unsettling ambient music from the security system seemed to warp and distort, becoming a harsh, grating drone. The low hum of the monitors intensified, slowly changing into a more distinct buzzing drone that vibrated through the room, through my teeth. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at my skin. I was being watched, not just through the monitor, but directly, intimately, right there in the security room. I spun around in my creaking chair, heart hammering against my ribs, expecting to see something standing behind me, lurking in the shadows of the small room. But the security room was empty. Just the glowing monitors, the humming equipment, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. But the feeling, the overwhelming, suffocating feeling of being watched, it was crushing. Back on the monitor, the shadow thing on the porch was still there, motionless, impossibly still, just watching, waiting. The chanting from the woods, though abruptly cut off, still seemed to echo in the silence, a phantom vibration in the air. The woods themselves felt closer now, pressing in on the house, on the security room, on me. And then another shape appeared on the edge of the woods, stepping out from behind a massive oak, and another, and another. More of them, those gaunt, shadowy figures, emerging silently from the trees, moving with an unnatural, fluid grace, relentlessly gathering at the house, surrounding it, enclosing it. Panic finally broke through the last vestiges of my denial, a cold, tidal wave of pure, bone-deep panic that threatened to drown me. This wasn't faulty wiring. This wasn't animals. This was something else entirely. Something ancient, something malevolent, something I didn't understand and couldn't even begin to comprehend. Something dark and hungry, and it was coming for the house. Coming for me. I should have run. I know that now, with a clarity born of terror and regret. I should have just gotten up from that creaking chair, stumbled out of that security room, out of that cursed house, and run blindly into the woods. Anything to escape, and never ever looked back. But I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the monitors. It was like I was hypnotized, caught in some kind of dark spell, like something unseen was holding me there, forcing me to watch, forcing me to witness whatever was about to happen. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped, just cut off mid-note, leaving an echoing silence that was more terrifying than the chanting itself. The silence fell, heavy and absolute, except for the buzzing hum of the monitors, which seemed to intensify in the sudden quiet, filling the void with its oppressive drone. The shadow things were still there, surrounding the house, encircling it in a silent, watchful ring, utterly motionless. And the one on the back porch? It moved again, slowly, deliberately, with a chilling, purposeful grace. It reached out a long, gaunt arm, impossibly elongated, fingers reaching towards the camera lens. The shadowy fingers stretched across the screen, impossibly long, impossibly thin, reaching, and then they touched the lens of the security camera on the back porch. The screens went black. The security room plunged into a suffocating blackness, except for the faint, sickly green glow of the emergency lights that flickered on automatically, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like mocking figures on the walls. The power, it was all gone, cut off completely, and the silence that followed, it was thick, heavy, oppressive, a living thing pressing down on me. The kind of silence that screams in your ears, that amplifies the frantic pounding of your own heart. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in the oppressive dark, in that suffocating silence. Minutes, hours, time seemed to warp, to stretch and distort, losing all meaning. Then slowly, agonizingly slowly, I started to move. Stiffly, like an old man rising from a long illness, every joint protesting with a creak and groan. I stumbled out of the security room, pushing open the heavy metal door, and out into the night. Out of the house, away from the monitors, away from the darkness within and without. I didn't run. I couldn't run. My legs felt like lead, my body heavy with a dread that weighed me down, anchoring me to the spot. I just walked blindly away from that house, away from those woods, putting one foot in front of the other, not stopping, not looking back, until I finally stumbled onto the main road, miles from that cursed place. I never went back to the estate. I quit the job the next day, called Mr. Henderson from a payphone in town, my voice still trembling, and mumbled something about family emergency. I didn't even ask for my pay. I didn't want anything to do with that place, with them. Mr. Henderson called me back, left a string of increasingly frantic messages on my burner phone. I deleted them all without listening. I just want to forget the whole thing, to erase it from my memory, to pretend it never happened. But I can't. It's like a stain that won't wash out. I still see those shadows in my dreams, those tall, gaunt figures moving silently through the trees. I still hear those whispers in the quiet moments, that low, rhythmic chanting echoing in the silence of my own mind. And sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and I happen to glance at a security camera, any security camera, even the tiny lens on my own phone, I get this feeling again. This cold, creeping, paralyzing feeling that something is watching back through the lens from the other side. And I know with a chilling certainty that it remembers me too. So, what do you think was watching back from those cameras? Was it something in the house? Something in the woods? Or something else? Have you ever worked a job that just felt wrong? Have you ever felt something watching you from the dark, even when you couldn't see it? Tell me your scariest job stories in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories that will scare you at night, don't forget to like this video and click subscribe to the channel. It helps keep the lights on and maybe keeps the shadows away. For now,